Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, April 9th, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Angela, and hi, everybody. Welcome to our weekly current events session. And, it's going to be a seasonal subject today. But I would like to start with, first of all, a bit of a follow-up from last week. And remember, I spoke about the decision that Anthony Housefather had to make about his political future. And it seems, of course, that he did decide to stay with the Liberal Party. And there seems to have been, I would say, two motivating factors to this. One, he wrote in his email that Prime Minister Trudeau is giving him the responsibility to fight against anti-Semitism in Canada. And this is one of his important principles, meaning Anthony Housefather's principles. And the other one was another important principle of Mr. Housefather, which is to defend English language rights in Quebec. And the Conservative Party voted against English language rights in Quebec in a vote in the House of Commons. And only the Liberal Party of all the other parties voted in favor of, at least on paper, recognizing the symmetry between French language rights outside of Quebec and English language rights in Quebec. And the other parties didn't agree with that formulation. They would rather allow the provincial government in Quebec to handle English language rights in Quebec and let the federal government promote French and the Indigenous languages in the rest of Canada. So that lack of balance is what bothered Mr. Housefather. So at least for the time being, he's going to stay with the Liberal Party. And polls are showing that no matter which party he would run for, he'd still win the election. But polls are also showing that the Liberals will lose the election. So, if he sticks with it, then he will be just a member of the opposition. But this whole business is more like a year and a half down the road. And so a lot can happen between now and then. And of course, like anybody else, he's free to decide his own future. And, in 2 years' time, if he's a member of the opposition, he might say, well, you know what, I've served long enough and I'm going to take a job elsewhere. The other, before I get to my main subject, I wanted to point out a very interesting series of essays written by two different ultra-Orthodox Jewish writers on the subject of the draft or the conscription or the compulsory conscription in Israel. And these have been given wide publicity and have been written about them. The essays themselves have been referred to in many different publications. So I thought I would just give you a bit of a summary of the two of them, which obviously logically stands to reason that this whole subject is coming to a boil right now because the Supreme Court of Israel has ended its exemption period for the ultra-Orthodox students, and they are now eligible to be drafted. The court also ended some of the subsidies that have been paid to educational institutions where these students are studying. And since these students are now eligible for the draft, there is no reason to support them, because in a certain sense, by supporting them studying, you are evading the law of the draft. So that's why these subsidies have come to an end in part. The number that I read was something like $50 million, which is considerable, but not the entire sum that the government is spending on subsidizing these students. So these essays were written from two different points of view, or two different ways to look at things from the ultra-Orthodox viewpoint on conscription. Obviously, the Hamas massacres and the Hamas attack on October the 7th have brought this whole subject to a point, or to a crisis point, because of the nature of those attacks, because of the mass call up of soldiers to fight, because of the so far somewhere like 300 casualties that the soldiers have experienced in the war in Gaza. All the while, the ultra-Orthodox have not been called up to serve. Very, very few have volunteered to serve. And the politicians representing them are demanding that these exemptions continue, otherwise they will quit the government. And so Mr. Netanyahu, for many different reasons, but this one especially, is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So what do these two essays say? One is written by Mr. Donner, who says, look, that for 70 years, 75 years, that the ultra-Orthodox have been living in Israel, their numbers have grown from somewhere around 4% of the population to 14% of the population. The number of yeshiva students being given exemptions has gone from 400 to 66,000. That in all aspects of life, the ultra-Orthodox are free to practice their own religion, make a living, vote in municipal elections, vote in national elections. No one has forced them to live in places they don't want to live. No one has forced them to send their children to schools they don't want to send their children to. In other words, they live a free, completely free, independent, democratic life in the state of Israel. Now, what does Israel ask in return for this? Or what should Israel ask in return? They have to pay their taxes like everyone else pays their taxes. They have to abide by the laws of the municipality like everybody else has to. They have to park where they're supposed to and not park where they're not supposed to, in other words. The civil law of the country applies to them as well as the civil law applies to anybody else. But in terms of religion, they are 100% free to practice their religion. Marriage, divorce, and burial are in the hands of religious authorities in any case. And so they are benefiting from the freedom that Israel offers for their religion. They're benefiting from the economy that Israel has built up, in many cases, to subsidize these ultra-Orthodox people in payments of family allowances, in payments of stipends to students, and in all kinds of other payments and subsidies that the ultra-Orthodox get. And yet, Mr. Donner writes, they, when called upon to sort of give something back to the state, all they offer is, well, we can pray for the well-being of the state and the well-being of the soldiers, but in practical terms, the amount that they're contributing is nothing. And so what he's saying is that it's time for the ultra-Orthodox to consider some form of national service to the country, and always with the proviso that not one scintilla or 1 ounce of change be brought to the ultra-Orthodox community. In other words, if they were able to serve in a completely isolated way, in a way that would not lead them to so-called temptation, in a way that they would not come in contact with females, in a way that they're able to do all their daily prayers, in a way that they're able to keep the calendar in a religious way, then, you know, these people should consider some sort of national service. So there's a lot of, as you notice, a lot of provisos there, but that's the only way that the ultra-Orthodox themselves and their leaders would ever agree to any service by these people. So it was always felt and feared, and it's been written that the leaders are afraid to send their youth to national service because they might be tempted to change their lifestyle, to become more secular. And that's probably the main motivation why the ultra-Orthodox rabbis don't want their youth to go serve, to be anywhere outside of their own confined walls of community. But life is slowly changing in Israel, and you know there is more and more contact between the ultra-Orthodox and the outside world, just because of the way things develop, the way the economy works, the way they've spread physically into some non-Orthodox communities, and you know it's a kind of a, we'll call it a inferiority complex that they have, or a lack of belief in the strength of their own faith, that would say, well, you know, our youth could be so easily tempted. So that's the opinion of this Rabbi Donor, who represents, we'll say, the more open or more liberal or more, yeah, those elements of the ultra-Orthodox community. There's no question that within the ultra-Orthodox community of Israel, which are in numbers probably somewhere between around 1.5 million people, and that's a lot of people, somehow representing somewhere like 14% of the population. So 1.5 million out of 10 million is you know, quite a lot of people. They aren't exactly all the same. There are some which are more, you know, belonging to different sort of, we'll call them, I don't like the word sects, but we'll call them different movements within the ultra-Orthodox milieu, following different rabbis with somewhat different traditions. So there have always been some more open and some more closed, we'll put it like that, among the ultra-Orthodox community. Now, the opposite opinion was written by an ultra-Orthodox Jew living in Jerusalem, I believe, Mr. Kornreich. And what he said is, look, that the vast majority of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel are either non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. That the community had a belief that only God could bring about the redemption of Israel. They did not ask for the state to be created. They did not support the state being created. That they were fine as it was living they were fine living in Europe until the Nazis arrived. But the ones who were living in Israel, some of them were there since the 1700s, living under Ottoman rule, and they were fine with that. Their belief that only God could bring about the redemption of a state of Israel is saying that they are criticizing the secular leaders who gave birth to the state, because in a certain sense they took God's job in their hands, and of course this means heresy. So in that way, some are still really opposed to the state of Israel in its political nature. However, like I said before, they benefit from all the benefits that the state does give them, and moreover, they vote in elections. So, you know, if they really didn't believe that the state had a right to exist, they shouldn't be voting in elections, because that confirms your identity as a citizen to the state. But, you know, they both oppose the state and take all the benefits all at the same time. So there is a bit of a kind of a contradiction. But his essay did bring about quite an interesting point, which is that He said that in the War of Independence in 1948, he said that the ultra-Orthodox that were living in there, of course, had no choice but to become citizens of Israel once Israel became a country. But what he also wrote was that the fact that Israel became a country put Israelis at risk because the Arabs all around them refused to recognize Israel. And Israel has fought, of course, many wars with many thousands of casualties, precisely because a state was created. In other words, he's saying that if a state was not created, Israel would not be suffering all the suffering that it's had up until including October the 7th. So what he's saying is that a kind of that Israel's creation against the rule, against the wishes of God, has brought about this penalty of the Jews constantly being attacked. And so the Jews are not secure in the state of Israel. And why should the ultra-Orthodox kind of go along with this, this heretical status only to make their future lives more dangerous because the Arabs will continuously want to end that state. The interesting point that he brought about was that he mentioned was this one. He said, let's pretend, and you can think about this also, let's pretend that Israel did not win the War of Independence. Let's pretend that in 1948, the Arab states who had conquered, would have conquered Palestine and would have set up a Palestine state run by Palestinians in the majority, but the Jews would be allowed to stay in the country, or the ones who wanted to stay could still stay in the country. And he said, look, if that were the case, do you think that the Jews who were left over in Palestine, and remember, they were a third of the population at the time the 1948 war broke out. He says, do you think that those people would be satisfied to stay under Palestinian Arab rule? Or do you think that they would somehow or other continuously want to assert their right to an independent country or an independent province or something like that? So he said, of course, they wouldn't just meekly give up. So he says, well, how could you expect the Arabs to meekly give up, especially since they are a majority in all the countries around Israel? So in other words, what he's saying is that, and I think his point, the point about the Israeli Jews, what would their status be like in an independent Palestine? It's an interesting one to think about. But he's saying basically that the ultra-Orthodox should not participate in the Israeli military because this goes against what God would want and only serves to prolong the agony of the Jews living in Israel by having the Arabs continuously fighting against them. So that's his point of view. And like I said, to me, there's some hypocritical elements in there because, if you don't like the state, why don't you leave? And if you don't recognize the state, why do you vote in its elections? I think the voting in the elections to me is definitely a marker that you do want to influence the state and how it works. So those are two different points of view representing within ultra-Orthodox Judaism two different factions, we'll call them. Anyway, you can read more about this if you Google the two names that I mentioned, Kornreich and Donner. Also, just before we go on to something else, let's see here that just to summarize the pressures that Mr. Netanyahu is under, he's under pressure from the US to open Gaza up to all kinds of foreign aid. He's under pressure from the whole Israeli population, except for his own supporters to do something to bring the hostages back. And, demonstrations have reached already 500,000 people. He's under pressure from the ultra-Orthodox because they want their draft continued and they want their money for their institutions, and they don't want to serve in the military just like before, and they're threatening to bring down the government. And he's also under pressure from his right-wing nationalist, racist component, who say that unless Israel completely 100% destroys Gaza and defeats the Hamas in Rafah, that they don't want to be part of the government. And right now, Israel, you might have heard this week, they've withdrawn almost all their troops from the Gaza Strip for a pause, for kind of a refueling, reconsidering pause. And to this point anyway, negotiations about releasing the hostages are not anywhere. There's rumors, but until we see something, we obviously can't believe anything. So you can just imagine the pressure that Mr. Netanyahu is in from all these different contradictory, we'll call them, pressures. And, the new polling that just came out yesterday continues to show that he would massively lose an election, and that over 70% of Israelis would like him out no matter what. So, he's living a life which I'm sure is full of stress for him. And, you just wonder where all of this is going to end. So that's just a brief summary. The subject that I wanted to speak mainly about today, though, is in a certain way connected, but of course it's connected to Passover holiday, which is coming up for us, for the Jewish people, coming up this month. And the question that when I was a 10-year-old or 12-year-old boy, was asking myself is, this story about the Exodus and the 10 plagues and Moses and the 10 commandments and the wandering of the Jews in the Sinai, it all sounds so fantastic. Is it possible that it could really have happened? And how could we possibly know if this is a true story, or if this is a myth or a fable, or is it something which is somehow based on reality, but which was expanded afterwards? I mean, besides what's written in the Bible, and it's written so clearly, are there any other outside sources that tell the same or similar stories? And I think this is probably a subject that most people at one point or other ask themselves, people who are students of the Bible, people who've gone to school. And to me, it's a fascinating subject and a fascinating question to ask. And I remember, of course, asking my teachers when I was in school, is all these stories in the Bible, are they true? Is there some way to prove them? And the answer that we got basically was something like, well, you have to believe that it's true, because if you start checking and picking and asking too many questions, you're not going to be satisfied with the answers. So it's a matter of faith. Either you believe it or you don't believe it. And there's no point looking into each and every story and finding out if there's any historical basis to it or not. Unfortunately for me personally, this was not an answer that I like to get, because just like anything else in life, you want to know something is, if it's true, you want to have proof it's true. If it's not true, well, then it's not true. So, the idea of you just have to believe it was not, for me, was not a satisfactory explanation. But lots of people have asked the same questions, and lots of people have delved into historical, archaeological, scientific, you name it, all kinds of ways to show or show that what's written in the Bible is indeed true or isn't true. In other words, lots of research has looked into this story, especially since the founding of the State of Israel and the beginning of the 20th century. when modern archaeology, or late 19th century, when modern archaeology got its source and basis as a scientific method, and by uncovering and dating artifacts, one is able to sort of recreate a picture and tell a story of something that happened a long time ago. And this archaeological study formed the sort of platform, or the basis of looking at the Bible from a historical point of view and not from a religious point of view. And so if the Bible mentioned, for example, the city of Jericho and the destruction of Jericho, people said, well, let's go to Jericho. And now that we know what we're doing, let's look and see if Jericho was a real city, if it was ever destroyed, and how can we sort of match up the stories told in the Bible with the stories that archaeology tells us. And so from this general sort of way of examining the historical facts in the Bible, we can decide whether this whole, whether the Bible is a complete fiction, or whether it's an accurate history, or whether it's a mixture of both. And this has been really a theme in Israeli archaeology, to kind of take the Bible as a source and go look for things that might confirm that the stories told in the Bible are true. And fortunately for us, and fortunately as time has passed, there have been many different researches going on in different places to show us that for sure the stories that the Bible's mentioned, the places that the Bible mentions, the battles that the Bible mentioned, that many of these indeed did happen. Of course, you know, some of the dating in the Bible is suspect, and there are no kind of there is no kind of let's say guidepost to say, well, this is what happened in year one, and this is what happened in year two and year three, etc. So there isn't a real beginning point of time where we can measure things against. But nonetheless, I think the conclusion is really clear, that if you wanted to speak in general about whether the Bible is historically correct, there's no question that there are things in it that are historically correct, just as there are things in it that are impossible to believe. Certainly, the story about the creation of the world 6,000 years ago is something which, although the Bible doesn't mention 6,000 years ago, if you add up the different generations, that's what scholars have come to. Well, clearly we know that this is something which is completely not the case. The Bible also talks about people who've lived to be 900 years old, and clearly we also know that's not the case. So some things are in the realm of myth. Other things, especially the later historical mentions of the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and in the later books of the Bible, the Persians, well, we know for sure that these empires existed, and in their own writings they talk about conquering Judea and Israel, and so we know that those things match up pretty well. So that's a kind of a, we'll call it a kind of an introduction to looking to see about the story of Passover and Moses and the escape of the Hebrew people from Egypt. And the very first question that people would ask, would say, well, what this is such a detailed story. It's such a story full of so many details, the 10 plagues and the escape and the parting of the Red Sea and the closing of the Red Sea on the Pharaoh's soldiers and the escape to Mount Sinai. I mean, so many of these things are told in such detail that the detail gives us an idea that somehow or other this must have happened or is an echo of stories that inspired people to write this down. In other words, you know, when you have a story that has a lot of details in it, the more details you have in it, the more likely that some of them are true, because otherwise, who's going to make up such a fantastic story out of nothing? You know, except nowadays in Hollywood, naturally that goes, you know. Um, um, but the Egyptian kingdom has existed now with written records going back, you know, roughly from 3000 BC to 0 BC, you know, when the Romans took over. And they have tons and tons and tons of writings, both archaeological findings on walls, hieroglyphics telling stories of different pharaohs, lists of goods and taxes that pharaohs collected from all kinds of people, stories of battles won and lost, um, stories of family quarrels among the pharaohs, um, papyruses that have somehow survived, also telling, narrating what life was like in Egypt over a period of 3,000 years. So there is a lot of physical evidence that Egyptians wrote down. There were special scribes whose only job it was to record the lives of the pharaohs and their accomplishments. So it's not because there is no written record, as we would have, say, here in North America or South America, where there's not much written record of what the lives were like of the people who lived here. But in the case of Egypt, there's tons of written records, tons of them. And yet, in all those written records, there is no mention of a person named Moses. There's no mention of the 10 plagues. There's no mention of Jews escaping from Egypt to go into the Sinai. So there's no first-hand written information to corroborate what the Bible says. And you know, if it's true that the Hebrew people, Israelite people, or the Jews, however you want to call them, spent 40 years in the Sinai desert, there also is no, and according to the Bible, there were some 600,000 people there, which is also certainly an exaggerated number, but they haven't found massive evidences of huge numbers of people having lived in the Sinai. You know, no pots, no lamps, all the stuff that you normally would find. I mean, they have some of these things, but not massive amounts of these objects that would point to a huge number of people having lived there for 40 years. Mostly, as you know, the Sinai peninsula is a desert, and the Bible says that this is where the Jews wandered around for 40 years after escaping Egypt before they got into the Holy Land. So from a prima facie point of view, from an archaeological point of view, from an Egyptian historical point of view, there doesn't seem to be any corroboration of the Exodus story at all. And yet, so that's one part. But the and yet part is that there is something. It's not that there's absolutely nothing, but there is something. So what the something is, is that the Egyptians write about tribes coming in from Western Asia, meaning from where Israel is, coming to settle into Egypt. And they refer to people called Hyksos, which are, it's a Greek word, because it's Greeks writing this, who at some point even took over the rulership of Egypt. And eventually these people were demoted and expelled, and the Egyptians proper took back the crown of Egypt. Also, there is reference in Egyptian writing to the name Israel, or to the word Israel, where an Egyptian scribe writes lists of gifts and taxes that were collected by the Pharaoh from many, many peoples, including people who he called Israel. So, like I said, there is evidence in non-Jewish sources that a people called Israel existed in the olden days, a long time ago. And a long time, we're talking maybe 1200 BC, 1300 BC. But there isn't any mention of the escape from Egypt, the story, the Passover, the 10 plagues, etc. That there isn't any mention of in ancient Egyptian sources. But someone wrote, and I was just reading this one and doing the research for this little bit of a paper here. Somebody wrote, you know, that in the 1973 war, the Sinai War between Egypt and Israel, made famous in that movie Golda, if you saw it, that don't know if it's the Egyptians or the Israelis, lost a vehicle in the Sinai, and they found it buried under, I'm looking at my notes here, 16 meters of sand. So 16 meters of sand is like 50 feet of sand. Just since 1973, buried this Jeep. So what the writer is saying is, well, you know, if the Jews were wandering around the Sinai in 1300 BC, it's only normal that all the things that they were using and having would have been buried also, and that as they say, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, meaning that just because you can't find it doesn't mean it was never there. Maybe it is there, but we just can't find it. So, so that's the sort of counter idea. There are all kinds of other sort of, we'll call them explanations or trying to figure out, kind of make sense of what the Bible says. And just excuse me one little second again. Sorry about that, my air conditioner went on. So there are all kinds of people who try to figure out, using the Bible, to try to sort of get some ideas of where, you know, what you know, how this could have possibly happened. I know I read two books by this very famous, we'll call him a philosophical scientist, Immanuel Velikovsky, who was a Jewish writer living in the 20th century, and he tried to provide scientific evidence of the 10 plagues using astronomy, using science to explain how they could have happened. talking about an asteroid having come close to the Earth and um, causing the 10 plagues. And it's such an interesting book. No one, the way he argued it was so interesting, but there's no real confirmation that this could have ever happened. So just to say, people thought long and hard about trying to somehow or other give a scientific basis for the stories that were written in the Bible. For sure, we know in later times, as I said before, that a lot of the Bible stories have been confirmed by lots of outside sources. So, for example, the existence of King David is mentioned in the Moabite stele, in other words, a monument that was put up by the king of Moab, which is now in Jordan, saying, I fought a battle with King David and I defeated him. So therefore, this says, well, okay, there was a King David and he was a king and he did fight battles, with his neighbors around him. But to go back to the Exodus times, that's where evidence gets thinned out. So what are some of the theories? So one of the more compelling ideas is that the people who became the Jewish people lived in the land of Canaan, as it's written in the Bible, along with their neighbors who were called Canaanites. And they lived with them for a long time. The Bible somehow says that once the Jews came into the land of Canaan, they sort of quickly got rid of these people. But the archaeological evidence shows that this isn't so, that they coexisted and lived together for a very long time. And that it's likely that some Jews went to Egypt, but not all of them. In other words, that there were a group of people who went to Egypt and a group of people who stayed in Canaan. And this seems to be the sort of going hypothesis. One of the writers that I was reading about, his speculation was that it was the tribe of Levi who went to Egypt. And they were the ones who formed the priestly class. They were the ones who sort of made up a law, made up the law of Moses, and brought the law back to their fellow Israelites when they came back into Canaan or into Israel. So that's one theory. And they point to the fact that the Bible mentions the names of the people from the tribe of Levi. Many of them had Egyptian names. So Moses, you should know, is an Egyptian name. It's not a Hebrew name. Aaron is also the same thing. Pinchas is also the same thing. Hophni and Hur are also the same thing. These are names mentioned in the Bible of people belonging to the tribe of Levi, and all these are Egyptian names. Whereas the people, from other tribes don't have Egyptian names. Well, who knows what that could mean? The oldest actual parts of the Bible are the Song of Deborah and the Song of Miriam. Now, these are poems that were written in a style of Hebrew which was not continued in the later parts of the Bible. So that's how we know that these are the oldest ones. And in the Song of Miriam, they don't mention the name Israel at all. And in the Song of Deborah, they only talk about 10 tribes and give the names of 10 tribes and not the tribe of Levi. So the speculation is, of course, you see that, the Levi tribe separated themselves off because they were in Egypt, whereas the other tribes stayed in Israel. So that's just the speculation that this this writer has talked about. For sure, modern biblical research done a lot by German scholars in the 19th century and early 20th century, looking at the Bible from a literary point of view, from a language point of view. They have come up with the idea, which is, I think, pretty well accepted nowadays, that there were two versions written of the Bible, which later got combined. So, if you ask yourself, so when did this Bible, when was it, the Bible as we know it, when was it put together? When was it sort of, we'll call it edited and published in modern terms? And we could pretty well figure that this was done around 400 BC, meaning after the destruction of the first temple, by Ezra the scribe, who is mentioned in the Bible as having presented this Bible to the people as a way of teaching them and bringing them back to the religion. So the two versions that they talk about are one version which would have been written in the north part of Israel, in other words, by the 10 tribes who lived in the north part, and the second part written by the scribes of Judah who lived in the southern part. The southern part had the city of Jerusalem in it, and the northern part had as their capital Samaria in what is today Samaria. And these two versions talk about God in two different ways. So one of them talks about God as El, the word El, E-L, and El meaning God in Hebrew, but also El is used for God by all the Canaanite people living around them, also use the name El. And the one in the south of Israel, the Judah one, they talked about Jehovah as the name of the God as well. So in one sort of book or series of writings, one name is used, and in one another name is used, and in that way, they say you could see that these people were writing about two different experiences, and later on, these two words became synonymous with the one God that the Jews believed in, but the origins were sort of in a way separate. So that's what biblical research does. It kind of tries to try to look at what's written in the Bible and work backwards and figure out, well, why are there differences and how do you explain these differences? The Levite tribe sort of took. The Bible says that the Levite tribe were not given land, but they were there to be the priests and the teachers and the servants of the God in the temple. And so therefore, it fits in well with the idea that the Levites were not there in the first place, that they came from Egypt to join the rest of Israel, and they brought with them the teachings that they then presented to and taught to the people of Israel. And when the temple was actually built, that they were the ones who looked after it. So that's how that sort of theory fits in together. Now, there's another interesting aspect to this whole story, somewhat related, and that is the invention of the alphabet. I'm just going to check my time here. We got time, yeah. So we all know that the system of writing which is used in the Western world started with what's called the Phoenician alphabet. And the Phoenician alphabet, named after Phoenicia, which is today Lebanon, was used to write Hebrew and other Hebrew-related languages for a long time. And that this alphabet was then, of course, taken over by the Greeks. The original Phoenician alphabet and what's called Old Hebrew alphabet was written from right to left, and the Greeks just flipped it over to write from left to right. And then the Romans borrowed that alphabet, and it's the language we use today. And that alphabet, the Greek alphabet, is the basis of all the Slavic alphabets, Russian and all the other Slavic languages, because the priests brought the Greek alphabet up to the Slavic lands and they adopted it for them. But where are the first evidences of that alphabet? Were they in Lebanon, where Phoenicia is today? And the answer is no. They were found in the Sinai Peninsula, of all places. So so in other words, if the system of writing was invented in the Sinai, sort of how and why did that come about? And, it could somehow tie into this story of the Jews and the Jews leaving Egypt in some way or other. The most popular theory is that the inventors of the alphabet that we use today were people who were slaves or workers in Egypt who could not read or write hieroglyphics, because the hieroglyphics, the system that the Egyptians used to write, is very complicated and requires a lot of, excuse me, sorry, so much dust around here because they're working outside. The system of hieroglyphics requires a long education to be able to read it. Most Egyptians couldn't read. Sorry. Sorry. Most Egyptians couldn't read hieroglyphics. So this was something, again, that the priestly class and the scribes were able to do. But common people couldn't figure it out because it's a kind of like code. We'll call it some sort of like a picturized code. And, you needed a lot of study to be able to learn it. But the slaves and workers who worked for the Egyptians, who were Semites, what they did was they took some of the ideas of the hieroglyphics and they used the sort of idea of hieroglyphics to invent a simple way of writing. And what they did was they took a picture of something, a picture meaning a drawing of a hand or a head or an eye or an animal or a hook or a house, and they made a stylized picture of it, just the way the Egyptians wrote hieroglyphics in a kind of a stylized way of writing. But the great invention that they did was that they took this picture of a house and they said, well, whatever that picture, the first letter of that picture will make the sound that we'll use for all sounds of the same sound. So in other words, say that the word house is bet, and so the picture of a house, so in other words, the bet starts with a b sound. So every single word that starts with a b sound, we'll just put a picture of a house to mean the b sound. And that was their idea. That was, the super idea. And that was the alphabet. That's how the alphabet was designed. So Aleph, an Old Semitic means an ox. And they took a picture of an ox with its horns. And they said, okay, any little picture, any sound that has an a sound will be represented by a picture of an ox. Every letter that has a b sound will be represented by beit, which is meaning a house, etc. For every single letter in that old Semitic alphabet, there's a name of that letter which corresponds to a picture of something. So samak, in Arabic, the word samak means a fish. It's not used in Hebrew anymore. But the way they wrote that fish was just a picture of a fish skeleton. You know, all the lines. Where's my hand over here? Here we are. You know, you have some lines like that, like a fish skeleton, like you know, the bones of a fish. One line going down, another line's going across. That was the letter of samak for a fish. And ayin, you know, means an eye. So they wrote that just as a circle, meaning that's a circle representing an eye. M for water, mayim, is just like waves of water, like the M today, which was borrowed from the Greeks, represents M for water, mayim. And that's what they did. So that system, the oldest archaeological finding of anything written in that alphabet was found in the Sinai. So, you know, who can say which people invented that alphabet? But it for sure spread from the Sinai to the whole Middle East and was used, you know, in a continuous way up until today in our you know, typewriters and internet. And the earliest founding of that was in the Sinai itself. Now let's go back to what I was saying before. Where would be in non-Jewish writing? Where would be the earliest sort of mentions of the story in the Bible? And we find a Greek writer who wrote in 320 BC. So 320 BC, we have to remember, it's a long time ago for us, but comparing what happened in 320 BC with what happened, say, in 1300 BC is still 1,000 years later. So let's keep that in mind. So this writer, called Hecatus, basically repeated the story of the Exodus with the 10 plagues, with the expulsion, with a man named Moses taking his people to Canaan. So what he was doing in a way is obviously, or perhaps repeating the Bible story, which was well established at that point, but he wrote it as a non-Jewish person, and that is the earliest mention by a non-Jewish writer of some of the events that happened during the Exodus. There's another Greek writer who wrote a slightly different story, and he writes a story of how 80,000 people who were impure, led by a priest named Osireph, joined with the Hyksos, who were in Egypt. I mentioned that before. And they took over Egypt, and then they were kicked out of Egypt to the Syrian borders, where the leader Osireph gave a law code to his people and changed his name to Moses. So somehow or other, this story has elements of the Bible in it, but in a different, you know, in a different presentation. And these are two of the more ancient non-Jewish traditions that have some element or some ties to the Bible story itself. You know, in those days, of course, people lived and wrote and traded with each other. So for sure, the stories that they have passed around from one people to the other. The best example of this, which has nothing to do with the Exodus, is the story of the Great Flood, which is mentioned in the Bible having to do with Noah. And this story of the flood is told in what's called the Gilgamesh epic, which was really one of the most ancient pieces of writing found in ancient Babylon. and it was written long before the Bible was written, and it tells the story of a great flood. So the memory of this flood is certainly something that must have happened in the Middle East thousands of years ago, and was recorded by different people in different ways, and is brought down to us today in the Bible as a story of Noah and his ark. So it goes to show that it's tantalizing to try to work backwards and to prove what was in the Bible. And the Bible has told so many stories which archaeological evidence has found. The names of the places that this Bible talks about, like Megiddo and Hazor, and Gaza, even Gat, all the Philistinian cities, Jerusalem itself, of course, has so much historical evidence to show that the Jews have been living there, for over 2,000 years. And so, it's definitely, there were scholars who at one point wrote that the Bible is a 100% work of fiction. It was invented who knows when, and it's just a story of parables and fiction. And yet, every time there are archaeological investigations done in Israel, sometimes a little gem or morsel of fact is found to show that indeed some of the stories told in the Bible, the destruction of some of the cities told in the Bible, when you go to these places, you find fire and destruction and all kinds of this type of evidence. So it's definitely a kind of the Bible itself is a mixture of legends, history, characters, figures who lived in the past, and it should not be dismissed as some people did, as a kind of a pure fiction. And on the other hand, it can't be taken literally, because there are so many contradictions in there, and there's so many pieces of stories that make no sense at all from any kind of point of view. So it still is a puzzle. Maybe one day when one pyramid is excavated and one tomb in Egypt is found, and it'll give the whole Bible story saying, we had this bad leader who oppressed the Jews, and then they left us, and our soldiers ran after them, and they got drowned in the Red Sea. You never know. You just never know what one shovelful of dirt can find in the future. But as of now, this is as far as we've gotten. So I wanted to wish everybody a happy Passover. I also wanted to mention the eclipse, and I hope that you got to see it and enjoy it with the proper eyewear. And it's something which is again a freak of nature. And to that subject, by the way, the Bible has hints of having talked about an eclipse that happened at some point in ancient Israel, where they say that the sun stood still and the moon came out. So that could have been referring to something like that, like an eclipse. Anyway, so thanks again, and let's hear if you've got some comments or questions. Excuse me again. What happens here, I'll tell you, is that because our place is right on the ocean, the concrete deteriorates so quickly that every few years it has to be kind of scraped away and new coating put back on again. And the scraping away leads to all kinds of dust and debris in the air and on the ground. So this concrete restoration business is one of the best businesses in Florida because of the salty air getting into the concrete And if it does get in bad enough, it can rust out the rebar. The same thing happens, of course, in Montreal with the salt being put on the roads, and the deterioration of the Champlain Bridge was caused by that very same thing, the salt in the air that we have to deal with here all the time. So, Angela, anybody got any questions, comments?
I don't see anything yet, Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay. I want to wish everybody, of course, a happy Passover. And I'll see you on Zoom next week, but I'll be back in town the end of this week. So hopefully I'll be able to see you all in person this summer.
Mr. Dwoskin, I just saw that there's a question from an
Yes.
anonymous attendee. It says, how do you answer people who criticize Israel in Gaza when hundreds of thousands of civilians in Sudan have been recently killed and no one says boo?
I have, I feel exactly the same way, that there are so many more and larger humanitarian tragedies taking place in the world all over the place. And humanitarian tragedies affecting Muslims in particular. And Sudan is probably one of the biggest examples of it, where, according to the Hamas, 30,000 people have died in Gaza, and they don't count their own casualties. But in Sudan, hundreds of thousands of Muslims have died because of the civil war going on in that country. And there are no reporters, there are no United Nations investigations, there's no charges of genocide, which in fact should be laid. And not to mention the mistreatment of the Muslims in China by the Chinese authorities, closing down mosques and sending people to re-education camps, although in the main not killing them. If one wanted to look at these sort of tragedies, Afghanistan just keeps coming up all the time, et cetera, et cetera. So the double standard definitely exists. And the skill of Hamas in getting their story out to the world and presenting it in a way that they want it to be presented, their strategists should definitely win some sort of award for doing that, because they've been so good at it. I was just reading today, and you might have seen that Israel captured one of the top officers of the Islamic Jihad, who admitted that it was their bomb which hit the Al Ahli hospital, and that they lied about it and said it was Israel who did it. So, in person, you have a confession on video. Now, of course, people might look at that confession and say, well, he was forced to say it. So, you're back to square one. In other words, this is a war where people, there's what I say, there's what you say, and what the truth is. And, the Hamas have been so skilled at getting their story out, and people are so willing to listen to it, because there is anti-Semitism in the world, because Israel is regarded as the aggressor, and the Palestinians as the underdog, and the lack of skill on the Israeli side of presenting their version of events is really outstanding. And I ask myself a million times, how come Israel doesn't allow foreign correspondents into Gaza with them to show that Hamas is using the hospitals, to show the tunnels that were made under civilian structures, schools, mosques, etc. Why is Israel so reluctant to give impartial Western reporters access to, the battlefield, when every time Israelis are killing civilians and children and women, right away there are foreign reporters there on the Hamas side to show pictures to the world. So to me, this is a big failure on the part of Israeli public relations.
I have another question from anonymous attendee. It says, proof of existence of Jesus or a myth?
That's another wonderful question. And I think, you know, this is something which has happened much closer to our times than the story of the Exodus. And so there's um, many more writings talking about Jesus in the time of a generation after he died. So the Gospels, the New Testament, the four books of the New Testament, were all written and composed somewhere between 50 and 70 to 80 AD. Jesus died somewhere around 30 AD. And so these are firsthand stories of people who met him and spoke with him and listened to him. And of course, following that, you've got many more writings, commentaries and books written later on about Jesus himself. Jesus is mentioned in non-Christian sources. If I'm not mistaken, by Josephus Flavius, who was this famous Jewish historian who lived at the same time in the first century AD. And he is also mentioned in Roman writings of historians who lived at that time. So the idea that there was somebody named Jesus who lived at the time and who was a preacher and a religious leader among the Jews in Palestine is uh, pretty well historically accurate if you go by secondhand sources. And that's about the best that you could ask for. But I'll say the same thing again that I said about before, that any new excavation, under some house in Jerusalem might find who knows what story about Jesus that could be so. The tomb of Jesus and his burial coffin has been argued about. They found something that says this is the tomb of Jesus, but was it really, this is the, I should say, the sarcophagus, in other words, the place where the bones are placed. But whether this is true or not true, whether this is a forgery or not forgery, is still being discussed in Israeli archaeological circles. But it's pretty well sure by archaeological and historical facts that there was a person like that who lived at that time.
There's another question by anonymous attendee. Are Egyptian hieroglyphics related to Chinese symbol letters?
No, not in any way. Not related in any way whatsoever. They're two completely different systems of writing. Um, the 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 hieroglyphics system of writing is more related to a system of symbols which represented sounds, but a complicated one, a mixture of sounds and ideas, or sounds and words, we'll say. Whereas the Chinese system is strictly not a sound-based alphabet at all, but a simplified notation of things and ideas which are represented by characters or symbols. And so there's no element of a sound-based alphabet in the Chinese system as it was composed, or as it was written at the beginning. And that's why if each individual character represents a word, and each individual character represents something, uh, then you have no way of looking at the character and deciding how it's pronounced or how it sounds. You have to learn them one by one by one, and that's why Chinese is to this day, a very difficult system of writing to learn. But is, many people have asked over the years, well, why doesn't China just adopt the Western alphabet, and that way it would be so much easier for people to learn. And the reasoning behind it is simply that China has so many different dialects. In other words, words are pronounced very differently, but the symbol for those words are the same in all of China. So the Chinese system of writing lets people, no matter what dialect they speak, read and understand what they're writing. Whereas if they developed a Western sound-based alphabet, you would have 15 or so different major dialects in China, and each one would look completely differently. So they all would, they would all, in other words, have to almost learn 15 different languages in order to be able to write to each other. Whereas in China, everybody learns the system of characters, and everybody can read those characters no matter what they sound like. They're pronounced differently in the different dialects, but they all mean the same thing. So they aren't related at all. The two systems aren't related at all. But the Egyptian hieroglyphic system has elements of a phonetical language to it. And in actual fact, once they stopped writing hieroglyphics down, they wrote in what's called a demonic script, which was that they took some elements of the hieroglyphics and sort of simplified them and wrote the Egyptian language in that sort of simplified way. Unfortunately, the line of people who could read hieroglyphics was broken at some point in history because of all the history and invasions and everything that went on in Egypt over the centuries, so that there was nobody at all left in Egypt who could read hieroglyphics. And it was only Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in the 1790s where they found what's called a Rosetta Stone. And this Rosetta Stone was a 3-language monument that was written in hieroglyphics form, in the demonic form of hieroglyphics, meaning the simplified writing of hieroglyphics, and in Greek, which of course everybody, everybody can read. And so there you had almost a dictionary, which allowed scholars to work backwards. And once they could read the Greek, they knew exactly what the hieroglyphics said, and then they worked to figure out hieroglyphic by hieroglyphic what the words meant because of the Rosetta Stone. And as you know, Rosetta Stone, I think, is used today as a language learning tool, a company that took that name to use it. But it was found by French soldiers in Egypt in the 1790s. Anything else?
Nothing yet.
All right. It was good. Good discussion. Good questions. Love it. Terrific. So there is one more class next week online, and then we have a break, and then I start again. So I certainly want to again thank everybody for listening and tuning in and being so curious to learn new things and to hear a little bit more depth of what's happening in the news. And we have to somehow be aware that the news that we see nowadays is colored, and it's not a question of the newscasters lying and telling us falsehoods of what's happening, But by just choosing what to report and what not to report, the news people are making a decision as to what the audience is being exposed to. And there were times when, both in Canada and the United States and Great Britain, the news networks, the BBC, the CBC, and ABC, CBS, and NBC, were kind of, we'll call them sort of neutral in the way they presented news. So there was less editorializing or less promoting of a certain idea or philosophy. Nowadays, all of that is not there anymore, and we have a much more politicized news system than we had before. And so long as people realize it, they could make, their own conclusions. But there are many people who don't realize it, who take things at face value without asking the question that the first listener asked, well, why do we hear all about Gaza and nothing about the Sudan? And this is a choice that the newscasters are making for us, in part. It's not very easy to get a reporter into Western Sudan to figure out what's going on. Their lives would be in danger.
There's nothing yet, Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay, so you know what? I just want to say thanks again to you, Angela, and thank you to everybody for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening in over the telephone and on Zoom, and we shall see you next week. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.